You wake up, pour milk over your cereal, and trust that the carton in your fridge is safe. However, what many families across America didn't expect is that 7 different types of milk have just been recalled in 46 states. Behind the clean labels and farm fresh marketing, investigators found bacterial contamination, chemical residues, and packaging defects that could reach your table without warning. On the other hand, this isn't just about spoiled milk, it's about health, safety, and the hidden risks inside the food chain. Stay with us as we uncover what the recalls really mean for you. Charts. Part 1. The recall shock, scope, timeline, risk. Safety feels like a kitchen ritual until the system behind it flickers, because a recall is not gossip. It is a formal notice that something in the chain failed. However, the word recall is often confused with market withdrawal or safety alert, and the difference decides how fast families act. On the other hand, Class 1 means a reasonable chance of serious harm, Class 2 signals a lesser risk, and Class 3 is mostly labeling. Meanwhile, the label on your shelf does not explain any of this. Check the class before panic spreads. Panic, though, is not a plan, so the plan begins with a map and a clock that anyone can read. However, the map of 46 states only tells you where alerts were filed, not where your carton traveled. On the other hand, the clock tells a cleaner story. Inspection date, lab finding, company notice, retail action, each step stamped by time. Meanwhile, a week can pass between a sample and a shelf tag, which is an eternity for a family fridge. Track the timeline, not the headlines. Headlines like to name villains, listeria, salmonella, chemical residues, broken seals, and counterfeit badges that pretend to be approvals. However, these villains slip in through very ordinary doors: a cold truck that warms at the dock, a feed lot that carries pesticides forward, a sterile pack line that skips a step, a vendor who forges a mark. On the other hand, none of those doors exist in your kitchen, which makes the risk feel distant. Meanwhile, distance is an illusion when you drink it. The chain touches your table. Tables gather the people most at risk: infants, pregnant people, elderly, and those who live with fragile immunity. However, symptoms do not always arrive like sirens. Sometimes they whisper as fevers, cramps, nausea, or aches that wait days or longer. On the other hand, this is not a license to self-diagnose or to dismiss. This is a prompt to verify. Meanwhile, verification is a set of steps, not a guess. Confirm before you worry. By the way, you'll never know what's really hidden in your plate at chains like these. Subscribe now and protect yourself before your next bite. Worry fades when you learn where truth hides on the carton, because batch codes carry the history your eyes need. However, codes often look like static until you know their grammar, lot, plant, and date marks that read like a travel log. On the other hand, a string such as 2025-0618-PLT05 tells you when and where this milk was born. Meanwhile, recall pages list these codes line by line for matching. Match your carton to the notice. Notices are not abstract when you place them beside kitchen light, because a code in your hand either appears on that page or it does not. However, rely on official sources for the page that matters: the federal database, your state agriculture bulletin, and your retailer's alert board. On the other hand, screenshots taken today prevent second guessing tomorrow when posts vanish. Meanwhile, a 30-second check is cheaper than a clinic visit. Make the check a habit. Habits turn fear into practice when you understand how narrow recall windows can be. A single week of sell-by dates, a band of plant numbers, a handful of lots. However, that narrowness is why specificity saves families from needless waste and from needless risk at once. On the other hand, a blanket tossed to the trash is not intelligence, it is anxiety. Meanwhile, intelligence is precise, and precision is learned. Read the window, not the rumor. Rumor loves the word nationwide, but your carton is local to its code, and codes tell a calmer story than panic can. However, do not mistake calm for complacency, because cold chain cracks hide behind calm labels. On the other hand, the villain rarely looks like a villain on a shelf under soft lighting. Meanwhile, the system knows this and dresses risk in meadows and barns. Trust theater is beautiful and dangerous. Danger hides in speed more than in malice, because the journey from farm to plant to dock to store is a race against heat. However, delays at a backroom door turn safe temperature into feeding temperature for microbes. On the other hand, a shelf that sits beneath a warm lamp pushes the race the wrong way. Meanwhile, none of this appears in the font on the front. Cold chain cracks are invisible. Invisible does not mean inevitable if you slow the moment and widen the frame, because you can assemble a small proof kit before part 2 begins. However, your kit is simple. Bookmark the federal recall page, find your state bulletin, capture your retailer's notice center. On the other hand, add one close photo of every milk code you bring home, save by date. Meanwhile, those photos give you a time machine if an alert arrives next week. Keep the receipts of truth. Truth also lives in 2 short, anonymized blurbs that we can stage as examples. A reduced fat batch pulled for seal failure across a 5-day range, and a whole milk lot flagged after an inspection found a cold dock running warm. However, the point is not drama. The point is what a clean notice looks like: dates, plant codes, and specific sell-by lines. On the other hand, you compare, you do not guess. Meanwhile, a guess is expensive. Compare with calm precision. Precision turns a frightening headline into a navigable road, and roads get safer when we name the signs. However, we must acknowledge the trust tax that families pay when verification is outsourced to marketing. On the other hand, you can flip the cost by bringing the check home code by code, week by week. Meanwhile, this is patient work that rewards every breakfast. Small rituals protect big mornings. Mornings return to ordinary when you know where to look and what to log. And ordinary is a victory after alarms. However, the carton on your shelf might still wear a perfect farm and a perfect smile while belonging to a narrower window than you think. On the other hand, now you have the language to test that smile against a timeline. Meanwhile, the next questions get sharper and more uncomfortable. Why did everyday gallons end up on those lists? Now that you know the map and the clock and the grammar of codes, the story must step into the aisle where trust is sold by the jug. However, glossy meadows are not a guarantee of safe physics when pallets wait and doors swing. On the other hand, the most common failures do not announce themselves. They simply warm milk by a few quiet degrees. Meanwhile, our camera will go there next and name those hours. Everyday milk is under scrutiny. Part 2, Everyday Dairy. Under scrutiny, whole, 2%, and the big names. Trust begins in the aisle where families reach for the same jug they bought last week, because habit feels like safety when the label never changes. However, the meadow printed on the carton cannot cool a pallet or seal a cap, and physics outruns design the moment a door stays open too long. On the other hand, what sells is serenity, not thermometers and timestamps. Meanwhile, serenity does not kill microbes. Trust needs temperature. Temperature decides more than branding ever will, because milk is a race against heat from truck to shelf. However, the cold chain cracks at ordinary moments. A rush hour delivery, a dock without shade, a pallet parked under warm lights for just 1 extra hour. On the other hand, your jug still looks flawless when it finally arrives. Meanwhile, heat leaves no autograph. Watch the journey. Journey scenes inside stores rarely make the commercials, yet they shape the carton you take home. However, loading docks are bottlenecks where drivers wait, associates juggle tasks, and minutes spill into degrees that no label admits. On the other hand, a backroom fan feels like airflow but hardly counts as refrigeration. Meanwhile, those minutes decide quality. Minutes become risk. Risk hides in the most ordinary package features because seals and caps are the last locks between the world and your gallon. However, a tamper band that spins, a micro fissure that weeps, or a bulging sidewall under pressure tells a story faster than the sell-by line. On the other hand, these clues demand an unhurried eye in a hurried aisle. Meanwhile, haste buys problems. Read the plastic. Plastic and paperboard age differently under light, so long end caps beneath warm bulbs become silent incubators. However, the shelf near the dairy case door cycles temperature with every swing, nudging milk a little warmer, a little longer, a little weaker. On the other hand, you can map these hotspots by touch and habit. Meanwhile, placement predicts freshness. Choose the back. Back stock isn't background, it is the unseen prologue to your purchase, and that prologue changes by hour. However, when staffing runs thin, pallets linger, checks get rushed, and the log that should be meticulous becomes shorthand. On the other hand, none of this appears in the pastoral copy on the front. Meanwhile, systems write outcomes. Ask for standards. Standards vary across banners in ways shoppers rarely notice, because recall speed and signage depend on policy, not poetry. However, some retailers retailers post crisp tags and handle refunds without friction, setting a baseline for transparency that others should match. On the other hand, you have seen this in your grocery tours, where clear shelf tags make hard news simple. Meanwhile, transparency builds trust. Demand clear tags. Tags and notices matter only if shoppers can connect them to codes, so anatomy lessons belong to the dairy aisle. However, whole and 2% gallons from household names often carry plant numbers and timestamps in fine print near the seam. On the other hand, learning the grammar takes one visit and pays off every month. Meanwhile, literacy saves money. Learn the code. Code literacy turns recalls from rumor into decision tools, because not every batch is implicated when headlines shout nationwide. However, narrow windows of sell-by dates and specific plant IDs let you act precisely instead of fearfully. On the other hand, precision prevents needless dumping and needless risk simultaneously. Meanwhile, panic wastes food. Precision protects both. Both national brands and store brands may come off the same co-packer line, which surprises shoppers who assume separate universes. However, what changes is oversight rhythm, audit rigor, and how quickly each banner flags and pulls questionable lots. On the other hand, the jug on your shelf doesn't care about logos, it cares about handling. Meanwhile, process beats promise. Follow the process. Process continues after purchase inside your kitchen, where storage turns you into the final steward of the cold chain. However, the door of a refrigerator is the warmest place in the box, and milk stored there rides a gentle roller coaster past the safe range all day. On the other hand, the middle shelf at the back stays cold and even, which your milk prefers. Meanwhile, location is safety. Move the jug. Jugs behave better when you turn guessing into measuring, so a simple fridge thermometer is a quiet revolution. However, a $10 dial that reads 34 to 40 degrees teaches more than any commercial ever could. On the other hand, one glance at dinner tells you if your kitchen honors the product you bought. Meanwhile, numbers calm anxiety. Measure the cold. Cold discipline includes small rituals at the store because reaching deeper pays off immediately. However, grabbing from the second or third row reduces light exposure, warmth from doors, and stray fingerprints that compromise caps. On the other hand, you can also check the timestamp and sell by range, choosing the freshest batch in seconds. Meanwhile, tiny habits stack. Choose with care. Care starts before checkout by listening to packaging, literally and figuratively, since a hissing cap or sour hint is a red flag. However, subtle cues like a warped panel or sticky seam point to a leak you cannot see. On the other hand, retailers expect returns on compromised goods and learn from patterns when you bring them back. Meanwhile, feedback improves stores. Report defects. Defects show up in recall notices as cause codes and triggers, which you can mentally map to what you saw in the aisle. However, a listing for seam failure, seal breach, or temperature abuse lines up with bulges, leaks, and warm end caps from your visits. On the other hand, connecting notice to scene trains your eye for next time. Meanwhile, pattern recognition grows. Train your eye. Eyes sharpen further when you collect proof, because a quick photo of shelf placement, a snap of the batch code, and a note of store and hour make a tiny lab of your own. However, this isn't paranoia, it is the consumer version of quality control that companies claim they want. On the other hand, when patterns repeat, your documentation moves the conversation from complaint to correction. Meanwhile, evidence moves mountains. Save the receipts. Receipts of truth lead to a harder question that points beyond the everyday jug, because if household gallons face these pressures, what happens to the bottles we pay extra for and the tiny cans we trust with infants? However, premium labels and organic badges promise shelter from the storm while riding the same trucks and lights. On the other hand, infant formulas live under stricter rules but risk more when rules crack. Meanwhile, the story must escalate. Premium isn't protection. Ready? Part 3. Premium, Organic, and Infant. When safer isn't safe. Price looks like armor when it comes in a heavy glass bottle with a swing cap that whispers artisan. However, the most surprising thing is that armor does not change physics, because milk still obeys time and temperature no matter how noble the label. On the other hand, premium promises purity while riding the same trucks and waiting under the same lights as the ordinary jug. Meanwhile, the ad shows mist on clover instead of pallets at a dock. Price cannot pasteurize risk. Risk in premium lines often hides behind immaculate immaculate design because ultra-filtered and micro-filtered and cream tops sound like shields until the chain stumbles. However, ultra-pasteurized milk that claims a longer life survives only if the cold stays true, and a warm backroom still writes the ending. On the other hand, a single hour of drift can erase the benefit that the process sold you. Meanwhile, drift never prints itself on the front label. Cold still decides everything. Everything in the organic aisle wears the vocabulary of assurance, certified, humane, pasture-raised, non-GMO, and that language matters at the farm gate. However, certification governs how cows are treated and how feed is grown, not how pallets wait or how seals fail once the truck door opens. On the other hand, consumers buy a halo that cannot follow every crate through every door. Meanwhile, the halo comforts while the chain cracks. Organic isn't invincible. Invincibility crumbles in labs when residues appear where they should not, because a treated animal still leaves a biochemical signature if the withdrawal period fails. However, inspection snapshots have found traces that force cautious recalls in premium categories, not because the brand is evil, but because systems are human. On the other hand, the brand story never rehearses what happens when the test flips to positive. Meanwhile, the notice must rewrite the narrative. Science interrupts storytelling. Storytelling loves the phrase bottle conditioned and barn fresh, yet bottle conditioning does not repair a broken seal. However, packaging failures are democratic, from budget cartons to boutique glass, and a hairline crack invites the same microbes every time. On the other hand, a heavier cap feels safer in the hand and tricks the mind. Meanwhile, microbes respect no aesthetics. Heavier isn't safer. Without subscribing, the next time you sit down at a chain restaurant, you'll have no idea what risks are riding on that fork. Subscribe today, or keep eating in the dark. Safer is supposed to be guaranteed where the stakes are smallest and the risk is largest, in infant formulas and toddler milk stacked in careful rows. However, sterility is a promise made by process, not by shelf position, and shared lines can turn a clean day into a dirty hour if safeguards misfire. On the other hand, powdered products require preparation discipline at home that not every exhausted parent can sustain. Meanwhile, the tiniest mistakes loom largest. Tiny bottles, huge stakes. Stakes rise when counterfeit approval marks and misleading badges blur the line between marketing and oversight, because trust theater evolves quickly online. However, real government marks have a placement, a pattern, and a page where the seal can be verified, and fakes usually fail that triad. On the other hand, a badge on cardboard is easier to copy than a database entry. Meanwhile, verification must outpace imitation. Check the database, not the icon. Icons of safety also include the word sterile stamped on ready-to-feed cartons that look invulnerable to time. However, even shelf-stable aseptic packaging depends on an unbroken chain after filling, and pallets that bake in a hot trailer will punish the word sterile. On the other hand, the illusion of a bulletproof box encourages sloppy storage both in transit and at home. Meanwhile, bulletproof belongs to movies. Stewardship beats slogans. Slogans about extended shelf life distract from the curve that truly matters: bacterial growth versus temperature drift, because the math rises fast once thresholds are crossed. However, a quick visual makes the danger obvious: a gentle curve that explodes upward as a few degrees slip, reminding us why minutes matter more than marketing. On the other hand, your kitchen can flatten that curve with a thermometer and a shelf habit. Meanwhile, curves answer to numbers. Flatten your curve. Curves do not calm parents awake at 2 in the morning, so a checklist does. One that fits on a phone and lives on the fridge. However, step 1 is the lot code photo at purchase. Step 2 is storage rules for unopened and opened containers. Step 3 is mixing instructions with water temperature explained in one plain sentence. On the other hand, a folder in your camera roll named formula and a note of date and store turn panic into procedure. Meanwhile, procedure rescues nights. Keep the checklist handy. Handy also means knowing what to keep when something feels off, because refunds and investigations move faster with paper and pixels. However, receipts, carton photos, and timestamps pull your situation out of opinion and into evidence, which retailers and regulators respect. On the other hand, without documentation, even the most heartfelt story struggles to change systems. Meanwhile, evidence bends policy. Save the proof. Proof that systems can change arrives when brands communicate fast and clearly, which is where your callback memory helps. However, remember how our McDonald's investigation weighed speed and transparency as the 2 pillars of credibility in mass food systems, because those same pillars should hold here. On the other hand, a slow notice is an expensive silence for families who pour milk every morning. Meanwhile, credibility is a clock. Fast truth earns trust. trust. Trust frays when premium badges by complacency, because a luxury price tag can mask ordinary handling. However, every bottle rides the same highways and passes the same doors, which means oversight must be relentless regardless of font and foil. On the other hand, consumers can push for parity by expecting equal recall signage, equal return ease, and equal batch clarity across all price tiers. Meanwhile, parity turns status into safety. Demand equal standards. Standards must travel home with you, especially with powdered products that require measured water, clean scoops, and strict timing for refrigeration. However, you can turn prep into ritual, boiling water ahead for safe cooling, labeling mixed bottles with times, discarding leftovers on schedule without arguing with sunk cost. On the other hand, rituals beat guesses when sleep is thin and the sink is full. Meanwhile, repetition protects the smallest. Ritual over guesswork. Guesswork evaporates when we admit the uncomfortable twist, that the words premium and organic and toddler do not exist above physics or process. However, that twist is empowering, because it means one playbook protects them all. Code literacy, storage discipline, recall awareness, and the refusal to outsource verification to a meadow on a carton. On the other hand, this playbook looks plain next to glossy ads, yet it wins in real kitchens. Meanwhile, plain wins breakfast. Plain beats pretty. Pretty messaging often convinces families to switch categories entirely, leaving cow's milk for oat, almond, soy, or coconut in search of safety or tolerance. However, what many did not see coming is that recalls also live in plant-based aisles, with heavy metals in grain and nut lines, molds in legumes, and packaging migration issues across alternative cartons. On the other hand, the same three motifs follow there too: trust theater, cold chain cracks, and the trust tax. Meanwhile, the story isn't done. Alternatives have their own traps. Traps deserve light and not fear, so the next chapter will decode those labels, map those risks, and hand you habits that travel across every kind of milk in the modern fridge. However, the thread will stay the same: small verifications, steady storage, and swift attention to codes and notices. On the other hand, when consumers move faster than marketing, the balance shifts at scale. Meanwhile, the aisle ahead is crowded. Let's walk it with eyes open. Part 4. Plant-based pitfalls, marketing myths, and your action plan. Families who left cow's milk for oat, almond, soy, or coconut believed they were stepping into calmer waters, because less lactose sounded like less risk. However, the most surprising thing is how many of those cartons found their way onto recall pages too, dragged in by the same quiet enemies. On the other hand, the label still promises purity, foam, and wellness in one pour. Meanwhile, the fine print tells another story. The fine print matters. Matters of soil and sourcing come first with oats and almonds, because heavy metals accumulate from fields and water and don't care about brand identity. However, routine screening sometimes catches spikes that force a pullback on specific lots and dates with sober language. On the other hand, children's small bodies magnify small exposures, especially with daily use. Meanwhile, vigilance beats vibes. Check the lot. Lots of soy products stumble for a different reason: moisture and time, because molds thrive when storage or transport drifts out of spec. However, mycotoxin risks live mostly in preventable corners of the supply chain, not in your pantry myth. On the other hand, damage from a puffed seam or sour hint is real enough to return immediately. Meanwhile, smell is a signal. Trust your nose. Noses miss what packaging quietly releases, because caps, liners, and multi-layer cartons can leach when heat or long storage nudges chemistry forward. However, BPA or its cousins and adhesive migrants are migration stories, not monsters, and they rise with temperature abuse. On the other hand, the aisle displays serenity under lights that sometimes run too warm for too long. Meanwhile, heat writes history. Avoid warm shelves. Shelves labeled shelf stable create the laziest illusion in the section, because a septic fill is sterile in the moment of sealing, not in every mile thereafter. However, pallets that sit in a sun-baked trailer will punish the best process in the world. On the other hand, the box that looks invincible in your cart can arrive tired from the road. Meanwhile, stability has conditions. Respect the conditions. Conditions tighten again once the cart carton is open at home, because plant-based milks still obey refrigeration mathematics like any other emulsion. However, the door shelf is a heat trap that shortens life and flavor while you make coffee. On the other hand, the middle back zone buys more even cold and fewer surprises before breakfast. Meanwhile, placement is protection. Park it deep. Deep reading of labels pays back every week when you translate claims into choices that actually matter. However, fortified simply means added calcium, and calcium carbonate behaves differently from tricalcium phosphate in taste and absorption. On the other hand, protein counts swing wildly across alternatives, while added sugar hides in vanilla charm. Meanwhile, gums and carrageenan shape texture. Read past headlines. Headlines like barista blend are engineered for foam, not for families, because extra oils and emulsifiers behave beautifully under steam and unpredictably in long storage. However, this isn't a villain story, it is a use case story that should influence how fast you rotate stock. On the other hand, weekend latte milk should not anchor weekday cereal. Meanwhile, match product to habit. Use with intent. Intent also disappears behind sustainability taglines, where water footprints and transport miles spar for your attention. However, the most honest stance is local math, because a short, cold trip often beats a glossy claim made far away. On the other hand, choose better within categories while you keep your verification routine steady. Meanwhile, claims are theater. Verification is practice. Practice reveals how dairy and plant-based marketing share the same playbook: family breakfast images, sunlit tables, and nature in a font. However, trust theater only ends when you replace mood with method at the shelf. On the other hand, method looks unglamorous and works every time you repeat it. Meanwhile, repetition becomes armor. Build the armor. Armor starts online with 3 bookmarks that shorten panic into procedure: the Federal Recall Hub, your state agriculture alerts, and the retailer's recall page. However, a 60-second weekly scan on the same day creates muscle memory that beats rumor. On the other hand, email or text alerts turn drip news into useful news. Meanwhile, automate the lookout. Set the alerts. Alerts are only half the loop. The store is the other half, where you inspect before you pay. However, glance at seams, pinch the top panel for firmness, look for glue bleed, and read the code near the cap or bottom fold. On the other hand, avoid end caps that bake under lights and choose cartons from inner rows. Meanwhile, your hand is a sensor. Use your hand. Hands also hold the camera that secures your future refund, because a quick photo of the batch code and receipt anchors your timeline. However, rotate stock at home, oldest to front, newest to back, and mark open dates with a pen. On the other hand, freezing leftovers for cooking saves money when plans change mid-week. Meanwhile, waste is optional. Rotate and freeze. Freezers are for prevention. Response is another script when a recall matches your code. However, stop use, isolate the item, document photos, and follow the retailer path for refund or replacement with batch numbers ready. On the other hand, if consumption already occurred and symptoms appear, call your clinician and bring the exact code and dates. Meanwhile, precision speeds help. Document everything. Everything we practiced echoes lessons from earlier investigations, because Aldi's clean shelf tags and frictionless refunds set a transparency bar worth expecting in every aisle. However, McDonald's taught us that speed plus clarity is the only credible apology in mass food systems. On the other hand, when stores and brands move as fast as you verify, trust stabilizes instead of shattering. Meanwhile, hold them to pace. Expect their best. Best of all, the power balance turns with small, stubborn habits that outlast slogans, because the trust tax shrinks when you refuse to outsource verification to marketing. However, you are not powerless in a fluorescent aisle. You are precise, practiced, and patient. On the other hand, precision is contagious and improves stores that see it often enough. Meanwhile, breakfast can be ordinary again. Ordinary is victory.